Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we are tackling a really fascinating paradox in modern geopolitics. We're going to uncover exactly why historical mapmaking makes a modern BRICS military union virtually impossible. We hear so much noise these days about the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and all the new members, forming some kind of new world order. But to actually understand their limitations, we have to look past the breaking news and dig deep into colonial history. Let's get right into it.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering 1. The military myth. 2. Modern divides. 3. The great game in Persia. 4. The India-China legacy. And finally, 5. Economics, not military. So the big burning question we're starting with is this. Can BRICS actually become a military union to protect its members? Specifically, could this bloc act as a geopolitical shield for a member like Iran against military actions from the US or Israel? It's a massive question dominating global security talks right now, but the answer is actually hidden right inside the organization's own rulebook.
That brings us to Section 1, the BRICS Military Myth.
There's this popular narrative floating around that BRICS is evolving into an anti-Western, NATO-style military alliance. But the core mechanism of BRICS is a 100% consensus-based model. Think about what that actually means. Unlike alliances where a simple majority rules, in BRICS, if literally one single member state disagrees, the entire bloc is paralyzed. Any kind of collective stance, let alone swift military or diplomatic action, is structurally impossible if there's even a tiny sliver of internal pushback. And as we're about to see, disagreements within BRICS aren't just common, they are baked right in.
Let's look at Section 2. Deep internal geopolitical divides.
The recent expansion of BRICS didn't just bring in fresh economies, it brought in deeply entrenched regional rivalries that constantly trigger that veto power. During a global crisis, rather than moving as a unified shield, BRICS fractures. On one side, you've got the friendly faction, places like China, Russia, and South Africa. They use their own independent channels to criticize Western actions or offer economic lifelines to nations like Iran, but they notably steer clear of direct military confrontation. On the flip side, you have the neutral faction, India, Brazil, and Egypt. They stay strictly neutral, issuing pretty vague statements about restoring maritime commerce, but flat out refusing to point fingers at specific actors like the US or Israel.
But wow, the divisions go even deeper than that. Consider the Gulf veto. Adding the UAE and Saudi Arabia brought totally opposing Middle Eastern security architectures right into the BRICS boardroom. Both of these nations are highly wary of Iranian regional proxy networks, and critically, they both host major American military bases. Just recently, when Iran urged BRICS to condemn Western strikes, the UAE explicitly pushed back and completely blocked a joint declaration. You simply cannot build a mutual defense pact when your members view each other as active regional security threats.
And hey, it's not just politics, right? It's the economy. When Iran's regional conflicts led to the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping, it severely damaged fellow BRICS members. India, who happens to be the 2026 BRICS chair and a massive oil importer, suffered huge economic disruptions, even dealing with attacks on its own merchant ships. Even if India entirely disagrees with U.S. policies, it just cannot support an Iranian strategy that literally chokes off its own energy supply. At the end of the day, individual national interests always trump bloc unity.
Moving on to Section 3, Historical Divide and Rule, Persia and Afghanistan. To really understand why these regions are so fractured today, we have to look backward. Let's rewind to the 19th century and see how Western imperial mapmaking intentionally planted these seeds of division. Historians call this era the Great Game. For most of the 1800s, the British and Russian empires fought a massive Cold War for influence across Central Asia. Russia was pushing south, Britain was pushing north, and caught right in the crossfire was Persia and a patchwork of rival kingdoms like Kabul, Kandahar, and Herat. In 1828, Russia pushed Persia to seize Herat, which kicked off the First Herat War in 1838. Fun fact, a 26-year-old British spy disguised as a horse trader actually commanded the defense against the Persians. Tensions just kept simmering until the Second Herat War, which finally culminated in the highly consequential Treaty of Paris in 1857.
Look closely at what was actually written into that 1857 treaty. It wasn't just about ending a war. It was aggressive, calculated colonial mapmaking. Article 5 forced Persia to pull every single soldier out of Herat, but Article 6 was the real geopolitical weapon. It forced Persia to forever renounce any claims of sovereignty, not just over Herat, but over every single state in what would eventually become Afghanistan.
By forcing those terms, Britain essentially shielded those fractured kingdoms and made itself the ultimate arbiter, the final judge, of any future dispute between Tehran and Kabul. Why? Simply to maintain a permanent buffer state to protect British India from Russian expansion. This was an explicit imperial policy of divide and rule. They intentionally drew borders to keep Asian powers separated, suspicious of each other, and dependent on the West. Those exact lines in the sand created the deep geopolitical fractures that make regional trust in the Middle East so incredibly difficult to achieve today.
Section 4. The India-China Border Legacy.
That British divide-and-rule strategy definitely wasn't limited to Persia. It caused another massive internal fracture for BRICS, the India-China border. Let's break down this messy colonial cartography. The British Empire intentionally left behind highly ambiguous boundaries. First, you have the McMahon Line from 1914. This was secretly negotiated by Britain with Tibet, totally bypassing China's central government, so China naturally still rejects it as an illegal imperialist imposition. Then you've got the Johnson Line from 1865, which placed the Oxide Chin region under British influence, but get this, it was never even officially presented to the Chinese government. This created a vast, completely undefined buffer zone that is today's highly volatile line of actual control. It is structurally impossible for India and China to suddenly pledge mutual military defense when their very borders are unresolved colonial artifacts.
And listen, this isn't just ancient history. The BRICS nations are acutely aware of this legacy. There's a fascinating quote from Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that perfectly captures a prevailing viewpoint within parts of the bloc. He argues that Western powers are still actively exploiting these historical disputes today, using modern concepts like the Indo-Pacific as a 21st century divide-and-rule strategy to keep the Asian giants, India and China, pitted against each other. But, true to form with BRICS, there is absolutely no consensus on who is actually to blame here. The Chinese perspective largely aligns with Lavrov's view. State media frequently accuses Washington of exploiting historical border anxieties just to draw New Delhi into a Western alliance. The Indian perspective, however, acknowledges the messy British map-making, but places the blame for current conflicts squarely on modern Chinese expansionism, recent border transgressions, and Beijing's total refusal to clarify the current boundary.
The absolutely crucial point here is that while colonial history set the stage, purely modern drivers ensure this gridlock remains totally unbroken. Blaming Western imperialism alone oversimplifies things. You have China's rapid asymmetric economic and military rise causing deep, real-world security concerns in New Delhi. You have the China-Pakistani economic corridor directly threatening India's strategic interests. Both nations are fiercely competing for influence over smaller regional neighbors. Plus, incredibly strong domestic nationalism in both countries makes any sort of political compromise almost impossible.
Which brings us to our final section, economics, not military defense.
Bringing all of this historical and modern context together, what exactly is BRICS today? The reality, explicitly stated by its own members, is that BRICS cannot and will not become a military union. There's no central military headquarters, there's no unified command structure, there is no NATO-style mutual defense treaty. The vast majority of its members, India, Brazil, the UAE, South Africa, operate under incredibly strict policies of strategic non-alignment. They actively reject joining rigid anti-Western blocs because they want to preserve their own vital global partnerships. Even when members do hold joint military drills, they are strictly bilateral initiatives, never official bloc-wide BRICS operations. So, despite a very intense shared awareness of those historical divide-and-rule policies, the bloc fundamentally remains a forum for economic collaboration and financial governance reform. It is not, and structurally cannot be, a collective security organization.
So let's leave off with one final thought. We've just seen how lines drawn in Paris back in 1857, or by British civil servants in the Himalayas in 1865, are literally still dictating the security anxieties of the 21st century. If the ghosts of 19th century colonial map-making still paralyze modern geopolitical trust, can any diverse economic bloc ever truly become a unified geopolitical shield? It's a question that's going to define the absolute limits of our new multipolar world. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the maps you see.